probably get started. Welcome to the third and final day of this year's Information Ethics Roundtable. We're going to start off today with today's keynote presentation. We've got Solon Barocas from Microsoft Research and Cornell University. Take it away.
Hi everyone. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks to Northeastern for organizing it, especially Jay for all the hard work and folks who have made all the logistics happen too. I wanted to come to the event for many, many years, and it never really quite worked out, so I'm really happy finally to make it. And I have to say that it's been like a pretty fantastic few days. I've been spending a lot of time at mostly computer science conferences that have a very compressed time frame for presentations, and there isn't the same kind of like luxurious. I had an hour and a half, for instance, to talk and discuss. So I've really enjoyed the past few days, and I definitely will not be taking the whole time with the talk. Hopefully there'll be lots of time for discussion. So what I'll be discussing today is like an attempt to sort of do two related things. One is that I want to try to characterize some of the recent critiques that have been raised about the more formal work that's been done in computer science, mostly about fairness. And I'll be citing some familiar names in the process. And then I want to try to relate that, I think, to some more long-standing debates within law and philosophy. And then I'm going to try to be somewhat even-handed. I'm going to try to reconcile some of these seemingly divergent points of view. I think I'm conciliatory by disposition, so maybe I'm being a little bit too eager to argue that some of the stuff actually isn't as opposed as it might seem. But anyway, hopefully this will be a way of helping some of the more computationally inclined people understand some of the criticisms that come from other fields, and also the other direction. You know, what is it that we can actually say to the critics that gives a little bit more substance to what computer scientists are doing. Rob is not here this morning, but actually Rob mentioned to me that his potential title had been In All Fairness, and actually I think like a better title, which was a little bit more aggressive, would have been Doing Justice to Fairness in Machine Learning. And so I'll be kind of describing, over the course of this, I think, a way to be a little bit more charitable in the way we understand this work, even if we're going to be critical of it. Okay, so to start, I think what's maybe the single easiest thing to point out about the work on fairness in machine learning to date is that it is a conception of fairness as fair decision making. What we're talking about is how do you adjust the way that you make decisions such that those decisions might be asserted to be fair. And then this is just ultimately a very particular and quite narrow way to understand fairness. But this is not sort of more broadly about the way we set up society or even the way that we might design institutions or policies. This is really about making changes to the way that we're making decisions in very specific contexts often. And in particular, this is really fairness for the most part at decision time. There was some discussion about this yesterday that we might have a kind of more long-term view of this, how decisions kind of impact the world and circle back into the way we make future decisions. But generally speaking, this is the setup. So it's really a question of fairness in the sense that it's how to score people or select people at decision time. I mean, I have to decide who to hire, have to decide who to admit, have to decide who to credit. Rather than the following two possibilities, which is, you know, maybe we would want to change the environment. So for instance, think of the workplace, such that people, sorry, not the workplace, you know, let's say you want to change the nature of education policy such that when people eventually end up at the point where they're entering the labor market, they look quite different. So here this is sort of saying, you know, not the decision time as a point of intervention, but instead the kind of longer set of institutional policies that determine what people look like by the time they arrive at this decision. Or alternatively, we can think about how, if you stick with employment, we might want to make changes to the employment context in the workplace, such that the circumstances, the conditions under which people work, become more supportive or hospitable for different types of people. Or if you think about this in education, maybe instead of saying who do we admit, in the sense that we want to make sure that they succeed, we actually think of this as what kind of reforms can we make to the nature of education so that different types of people are more likely to succeed than they were in the past. And I put this out, which might really seem kind of mundane, in part because like we're really, generally speaking, not talking about these two other possibilities. Like fairness in machine learning has been squarely focused on this first idea. And what's really bizarre, actually, for those of you who might know the literature, this is even true of some of the work that's been done on causality in fairness. So to give a kind of quick gloss here, people have been thinking about how you can use causal graphs to represent the way that discrimination might influence some particular feature that might be considered in the model you're developing for these important decisions. And here, the goal of trying to describe this causal graph is not to then figure out how to intervene in that particular causal mechanism, which is what you might want to do if you were like a social policy person or a traditional social scientist. It's instead a way to say, okay, if this particular feature that I'm considering is somehow influenced by discrimination, I want to figure out how to subtract the influence that this discrimination had on that feature such that I can still consider that feature, or something like that. Or maybe I want to decide that I'm not going to consider that feature because it's been influenced by, causally influenced by this particular form of discrimination. But this is interesting, and it's very, I think, telling of the nature of the field, right? So causality here is not useful as a mechanism for figuring out points of intervention in the causal chain where you're going to direct policy. It's instead used as a way to figure out how, again, to just change decision-making at decision time. Right? So this is, I think, a very clear way of understanding that the focus here has been narrowly fairness as fair decision-making at decision time. And I think like a fair amount of the criticisms, which I'll review in more detail, have a lot to do with the following things. And this is sort of a restatement of what I said a moment ago, which is, maybe what we want to do is like foreground what is often taken as background in most machine learning. So we treat decisions as a matter of saying, here are the features of a particular person that might vary, and we're going to make a prediction about how they might fare in this particular circumstance. We treat that circumstance as background, right? Like that's stable and not open to change. What is in fact open to change is who we select given variation in their features, right? And we can invert this. We can say, how might we actually change the background conditions such that we actually get different kinds of features in the people who eventually apply for these jobs, or different outcomes given those features. Right? Okay. So I thought I'd also then quickly just return to this point I raised in passing, I think, during Jan and Josh's talk, right? Yeah. I think this kind of relates to this question about the degree to which we might see someone's responsibility for dealing with some of these issues having something to do with the proximity they seem to bear to the discriminatory origin of these problems. And I guess to be extremely crass, we can think about it in this kind of very broad way, right? So these very narrow conceptions of equality of opportunity or non-discrimination are sort of concerned with treating seemingly similar people similarly on the basis of relevant features at decision time, right? And the point of contrast should not just be like some other other kind of way of making decisions. Here it's actually like completely different, right? A broad notion of equality of opportunity, specifically like Rawls and other people, are not talking about changing like just small local decisions. They're actually talking about the general institutions of society, the structure of society, right? So here, really what it's about is making sure that society is organized in such a way that people, let's say, of equal talents and ambition can achieve equal outcomes over the course of their lives, right? This is a dramatically different way of thinking about fairness, and what's kind of unfortunate is that these terms, specifically equal opportunity or equality of opportunity, have been taken up in some of the literature in a way that really kind of confuses the matter, right? So in philosophy anyway, this can itself mean very different things, and I would say that pretty much none of the work in fairness and machine learning is trying to really achieve this. These are not questions about how to design the basic institutions of society or even what a just society would look like. Again, it's just kind of much more narrowly these kinds of things. But to kind of build on what was discussed on the first day, there's obviously something in between, which is something like this, right? So maybe what we want is to force decision making to treat seemingly dissimilar people similarly on the belief that their current dissimilarity is the result of past injustice. So this is sort of saying, like, okay, if people do look different at this moment of decision making, it might be because there are historical injustices which produce this apparent dissimilarity, and we might want to use decision making as an opportunity to undo some of that injustice. Okay, now let me come back to this question of proximity. So to maybe rehearse the same set of examples that I mentioned in my comment the other day, we can think again about building a model for employment decisions. And we can think about a bunch of different possibilities for how we could go about this. So for instance, Ruben the other day mentioned this paper from the British Medical Journal, which did something which struck me as incredibly silly in the first place, which is sort of training a model to be able to predict the decisions that the admissions officer would make, right? That was sort of the description there. And the goal here, as far as I can tell, would be to simply automate what was previously a process made by the human decision maker, not necessarily to do any better or any different. And I always struck this as like a kind of silly throwaway argument because in practice, I imagine no one will be doing that. The only value of doing something like this is maybe to put someone out of a job or like kind of deal more efficiently with things, not necessarily improve the quality of these decisions. But actually it turns out, having talked to companies that work in this area, this is like extremely common, right? So like there's no particular outcome that they're trying to use as the label. They're just saying like who was hired in the past, let's use that as like the label we're trying to predict. And here you can obviously see that like the proximity is like extremely tight in the sense that like if the decisions that you're trying to learn to reproduce were themselves discriminatory and they were made by people in an institution that is going to use this tool, you would imagine that they have some responsibility for actually dealing with that problem, right? I mean, there's other reasons this is obviously silly, as I mentioned, and you can imagine that for completely non-moral or non-ethical reasons, this would just be a bad idea, right? Okay. So let's think of something a little bit more sensible, which is like maybe we want to try to use a model to predict who will succeed on the job, and then that will be the basis upon which we decide who to hire. And here we have to choose some kind of target or label, and you might choose something like your annual review score. So here, I don't know, maybe academics don't experience this, but if you spend any time in industry, you'll have this experience of having your like annual review, and it's meant to be this very structured process, which is supposed to limit the degree to which bias can enter. But there's a fair amount of social science literature that shows even despite these efforts, implicit bias continues to be a problem. And so what this is kind of getting at is that even when we're trying to predict this seemingly more kind of objective outcome, it's of course passing through this subjective assessment of a human who will invariably have some kind of implicit bias. And here again then, what you're learning to predict is not necessarily how someone would perform on the job, you're learning to predict how a human would have assessed that person given like their own implicit bias. Right? So you're sort of training a model in a similar way to make a decision that a human would make. Okay. And again, you might argue that the reason that this is problematic is that it is the institution itself, right? It's using the decisions or assessments that that institution has made to train a model, and so therefore it bears the responsibility of somehow correcting for this. All right, and people have kind of thought about this, and they say like, yes, there's a danger in doing this. Let's force the decision to actually rest on something that is like not influenced by subjective assessment. Let's have like a truly objective target. And here, often people rely on things like sales. So for instance, if you work in a job where there's like some obvious metric, you might say here, you know, there's no question that this is actually just what people were able to achieve in their position. And I have this twice for reasons that hopefully will become clear. So I mentioned, I guess, the other day, one possibility here is that you know, maybe your sales, if you're looking at the difference between like how sales vary between your male and female employees, it may turn out that the difference in whatever annual sales rate is a function of the fact that there is some kind of discriminatory tastes on the part of the people that your employees interact with, right? So if, for instance, we can reverse this, right? Let's say women are like much more likely to be able to persuade people to buy goods than men. This might have to do with something with like gender norms and so on, and we might not necessarily want to say that that should be the basis upon which we decide to hire, even if that is an objective measure of their success given like the circumstance, right? And I should explain that actually this is like a very long-standing problem even in discrimination law. So when Title VII, like the Civil Rights Act, these were employment discrimination laws, were passed, there were lots of people who, in a way, quite reasonably said, if you force me to hire black employees, my customers will refuse to come to my store or to my restaurant, right? And this was sort of proposed as being a rational reason why, even though I might not be discriminatory, my business will suffer if I hire these types of employees. And there was a bunch of case law that actually established this is just not a justification, right? So even if your business might suffer some kind of loss because of the discriminatory taste of your customers, that is still something that you as an employer have to incur. And what's interesting about some of the machine learning is that that exact process can be happening here without you really thinking about it, right? So whereas in the traditional case, it was like someone knew, they're like, oh, I bet if I do this, this will have this effect because of the discriminatory tastes of my customers. If it turns out that our kind of measure of success is influenced by the discriminatory tastes of our customers, but we're not thinking about that, these models are going to be learning to do the exact same thing, and it's probably much less obvious that that's something to object to. Okay, now the final point I'll make is one that I mean in passing, which is that, well, maybe sales are an objective measure of how people have succeeded in that workplace under those conditions, right? So if, for instance, it's a hostile work environment, or people are sort of purposely given less promising jobs given certain characteristics, then this number is not really a reflection of like their true capacity. It's sort of how they've done under those particular circumstances, which themselves might be unobserved, so this can be like an omitted variable, or they just might be, things that people don't even recognize as being potentially relevant, but obviously affect people's performance. So again, it seems like quite challenging here to think that the institution that has such dynamics is not responsible for somehow compensating for them when making hiring decisions. Because if not, it sort of says that like there can be as much horrible stuff happening in the institution that actually affect how people succeed there, and that is perfectly useful as a justification for then not hiring people who do poorly in those circumstances. Right? Okay, and you can imagine, right? Like, like going kind of down this list, it becomes slightly more, I don't know, attenuated or less proximate, and you might have changing intuitions for how much responsibility people bear. But really, ultimately, these are all pretty, I think, convincing because like it's all happening sort of in or kind of next to the institution that wants to use the tool that is producing this training data set. But the further out we go, right, where it's not so clear that like the institution that is going to use this tool has any kind of direct activity that is impacting how this model will perform, it's a little less easy to argue that they necessarily bear the burden. And so, for instance, if we kind of just abandon all these hypotheticals and imagine everything was perfectly fine, but there was still profoundly unequal quality of education in the United States that kind of tracked economic inequality and therefore also tracked race, you might say that like, well, we have no responsibility to deal with that fact. We're an employer who just needs to make decisions. And I think in many cases, people might find that argument quite compelling. Why, as an individual employer, should I bear the burden of sort of compensating for the fact that there's terrible education along these very discriminatory lines? That's a problem to be solved with social policy. That's not a problem for me to solve as an individual employer or something, right? Now, I'm not saying I necessarily agree with that, but it's a sort of suggestion about what happens as we move further away from the institution. And I go through this entire exercise to kind of show that like this is, I think, in many ways, a lot of the critique as well, right? Some of this stuff is about wanting to reform something more radical, but there's also, I think, questions about how far we can go before people feel like it's actually a reasonable burden. Right, okay, so a different way of putting this is, how far can we go in justifying these changes to decision making, meaning like I'm going to tell the employer they have to change their way of making a decision. And the other question, which is like a little way of, like kind of maybe cute way of putting it, is how far can we go just making changes to decision making if our goal is something kind of more radical, right? Is there a sort of upper limit to what we can achieve by just changing decision making? And I think both of these are like very relevant questions for what have been the largely kind of consistent critiques of the work so far. Okay, so let me now turn to some of the recent writing that I think offers a very powerful critique of the kind of formal work in computer science. And much of it is kind of arguing that this is a very narrow vision of problems of justice and fairness. Okay, so I'll start with my colleague, Kate Crawford. Many of you must know her. Last year, she gave a number of talks where she had very powerful kind of aphorisms to make this point. So she argued that data can be neutralized as the new data is neutral. Which I thought was like very well put. That you can sort of like undo the bias in the data and somehow get to this ideal state of data being neutral. Where that parity, sort of parity in accuracy, parity in error rates, is not justice. Right? And very much in line with facial recognition, which I'll talk about more, that equal surveillance is not equality. Right? Kate was really quite pointed on this. Frank Pasquale also has a piece that I also highly recommend from last year. This is the piece in Real Life, an online magazine. His piece is called Odd Numbers, and it kind of is a meditation on some of the limits of this way of thinking. Frank himself is a legal scholar. He's very well known for kind of raising issues around the use of these kinds of tools, and has had a kind of moment of reflection on his own part, trying to ask, like, have I been focusing on the right problems? Like, maybe it is not just about trying to tinker with the algorithm. And so I'll just highlight some interesting passages from this piece. So he says, trying to make these games fairer, the research, meaning research on fairness in machine learning, elides the possibility of rejecting them altogether. He goes on to say, firms assume that the demand for accountability must be translated in some way into computer science, statistics, or managerialist frameworks, where concerns can be assuaged by a tweak of a formula or the collection of more data. And finally, no algorithmic system can circumvent the necessary and endless conversations that these ultimately political and moral questions demand. Again, I find this very powerful. And I say this as someone who's been working on these topics for quite some time. And then more recently, colleagues Julia Powles and Helen Nissimam, who was invoked a couple times yesterday, I should say, was also my supervisor as a dissertation, was my dissertation supervisor. And her piece on bias in computer systems, I should assert, is like the origin of my own interest in this work. And the degree to which I've been involved in trying to develop this work, it's been an extension of Helen's work in many ways. So I want to at least pay credit and homage to Helen here, where a lot of the work I think that many of us have been doing, if not directly citing Helen, is often in many ways inspired by it. But interestingly, right, this piece is in a way a kind of critical reflection on some of the things that Helen was calling for maybe 25 years ago, right? So you'll remember the piece that Tina showed us yesterday was sort of saying that fairness should become one among the many set of considerations that we care about when developing computer systems, right? And in a way that's come to pass, right? The past few years in particular, like finally this thing has sort of assumed its place alongside privacy and security as a legitimate thing for computer scientists to work on and something that actually needs to be paid attention to. And in this piece with Julia, they kind of are trying to say, like, there's been a danger here in focusing on bias. And so again, I'll just pull out what I think are some very powerful critiques. So, and you'll see that there's a fair amount of kind of consistency across these arguments. So they say, addressing bias as a computational problem obscures its root causes. It merely co-opts designers in perfecting vast instruments of surveillance and classification. The false allure of solving bias detracts from bigger, more pressing questions. And the end game is always to fix AI systems, never to use a different system or no system at all. And that we genuinely need accountability mechanisms external to companies and accessible to populations. Okay. So what I'll try to do now for the next little bit is sort of unpack these, and I'll try to pull out what I think are common themes, and I'll also try to relate this to, I think, some larger arguments that are not particular to machine learning, fairness machine learning. Okay, so to start, and this was like maybe not present in the quotes that I highlighted, but certainly this is like kind of common concern, is that this approach to what are often like very serious issues can feel remarkably bloodless, in the sense that we're sort of treating questions of people's lived experience of discrimination as something that can be reduced to these very formal representations. And here, I think the critique is not just about sort of like taking something quite seriously because of its normative seriousness, but also these kind of questions of like respect and dignity, right? So if we're talking actually about people's actual experience being subject to these decisions or systems, it is not something to kind of be trivialized by abstracting away everything that actually matters when people experience these things. And it also in a way is a kind of matter of efficacy as well, not just respect or dignity, in the sense that these systems are unlikely to actually work particularly well or to vindicate the kind of concerns that these populations have unless you actually understand their lived experience, right? So the bloodlessness is not just a sort of insult in some sense, but it's also affecting potentially how well these things are going to work. This was definitely, for those of you who were at Fat Star this year, this I think was one of the more like visceral things that was kind of felt at the time. I should say, for those who don't know, Fat Star is this conference that has a lot of the work on fairness and machine learning. Okay, A slightly different version is the sense that like this work is very naive. And naive I mean here in the sense that like you could imagine that you're making some intervention in the model, but you're not necessarily thinking about how the model fits into a larger institutional process. So one very obvious version of this came up quite a bit yesterday, which is, we might change how this recidivism model makes predictions, but we are like not attending to the fact that it fits into some bureaucratic process which involves a fair amount of discretion, lots of handoff, and so on. And so the idea that you can assert that these models will have some particular property and therefore the decision making will have this property is naive because it's not really thinking about the way this will be embedded in some kind of institutional process. Right? In some ways this can be like viewed as like overclaiming. So like somehow the computer scientists are asserting like, okay, we can like satisfy this particular definition, and you could say like that's ridiculous. You haven't really thought about the fact that this has to be part of something more complex. But it also, I think, could be like sort of seen as like maybe like computer scientists actually have more modest expectations of their own work, but it's sort of being perceived as offering something much grander. And so it sort of depends, I think, on how we assume computer scientists themselves are even thinking about what their tools are doing. But given some of like the rhetoric around this, I think it's a very important point, right? For the most part, I feel like what's been very scary is just how willing people have been to make these like strong assertions that once these definitions are satisfied in the model, that somehow decision making in general will kind of absorb the same properties. My issue with some of this though is that it's kind of interesting, right? So in a way, the criticism here tends to say like, look, if you satisfy these definitions of fairness, it's definitely not sufficient, right? Like this is not going to produce justice or fairness in any meaningful sense. But still, I would argue that we're almost always marshalling examples of injustice that rely on violations of those definitions, right? So we might not think that solving the problem with those definitions is sufficient, but it seems that like even critics are quite comfortable in saying that like failure to meet those definitions is more than sufficient to say something is wrong, right? And I think this is also something that we should explore more. The degree to which these are diagnostics rather than solutions, I think accounts also, or perceived as diagnostics rather than solutions, accounts for maybe some of this concern. Okay. A slightly different idea here is that, this is just by nature incremental. So if we're simply intervening in the decision making, we're like sort of accepting the world as it is and thinking like how can we tinker around the edges. So, a lot of these arguments that we saw were like not about tearing the system down, right? It was more about like how do we make sure that the system, which is going to remain, has certain properties. A different version of this, especially for those of you who've kind of read Virginia Eubanks' book, is sort of the idea that, we're sort of trying to optimize on situations when there are constraints, like limited resources. Rather than sort of saying the problem ultimately stems from the fact that there are just not enough resources, right? So this problem is not something that gets solved by optimizing more efficiently or being more creative about the allocation. It's a problem that should be solved by making sure that this problem has enough resources, right? So poverty is the problem that explains a lot of child neglect and supposed abuse, not necessarily the failure to figure out how to triage cases that come into the agency. Okay. A slightly different argument, I would say, is that this is unaccountable, and I think this has actually been borne out, especially in the past couple of weeks, where there might be efforts to adopt these tools as a way to assert that your practice satisfies some kind of principle. But these are largely just assertions, right? So like I'm going to adopt this definition as a company, I'm going to then tell you that you should feel comfortable because I've satisfied this definition, but there's just not some democratic process, and there certainly isn't the kind of transparency or due process that you also would want to accompany such things, right? So it's a complete lack of participation in any meaningful sense. This is not transparent in many cases in the sense that like even the definition that might be used is not transparent. How they went about trying to achieve or satisfy that definition is often not transparent. And there's really no independence, right? So even if there is good efforts to try to address these issues, there isn't really a mechanism to independently verify or contest or challenge what's being done here. Okay. Related but slightly different is the idea that this work is sort of complicit with the kind of forward march of a lot of inherently objectionable technologies. So I think the common argument that people are most likely familiar with comes from facial recognition, right? So if the argument ends up being something like, well, there's bias in facial recognition, we need to like address bias in facial recognition, people feel ultimately uncomfortable with this because like they will step back and say like, no, like it's not that I want facial recognition to work perfectly. In fact, I just object fundamentally to facial recognition. And if the issue is sort of narrowly scoped to just be about whether there's bias in facial recognition, it in a way sort of justifies spending even more effort perfecting the system, right? And actually, so in a way, it kind of cedes the more significant point. It sort of says, like, rather than actually making this a debate about what kind of society we want to live in, do we actually want to have surveillance cameras that can do facial recognition? It sort of says, well, we're going to have it anyway, but it should satisfy these particular properties. And actually, there's this amazing article from many years ago from Kevin Haggerty. Kevin Haggerty is a sociologist. He's done a lot of work in surveillance studies. And he, in 2009, kind of reflected on what was this long-term campaign in the UK against CCTV. So, I mean, I'm not sure how many of you would be old enough to remember this, but, you know, it was very commonly known that, like, the UK had the highest density of surveillance cameras. There were long-term efforts to try to limit this, and a fair amount of debate, actually, both on the part of advocates and even within the research community, ended up being about efficacy. So it was sort of like, okay, we're going to push back against the kind of introduction of CCTV by showing that it actually doesn't even work according to like the purported metric that matters, right? We're going to show that it doesn't reduce crime, right? Because that's like the justification for all this kind of stuff. And what Haggerty is able to show is that like this was sort of like the strategic blunder of the advocacy because in a way it gave up like the important ground. It sort of said that like it's okay so long as it worked, when in fact, like really that was never the issue at all. So this quote, which like it might not be clear is actually about CCTV, is remarkably relevant to the current discussion about facial recognition. So I'll just read it because I find it like actually remarkable how much these are kind of substitutable. So for individuals concerned about wider social implications of surveillance technologies, debates about the valuation studies are insidious, precisely because they fixate exclusively on a standard of functioning. Such a narrow frame ignores the prospect that the true nightmare scenario might be that all of these technologies might actually work, that they might function perfectly with full enrollment, complete transparency, seamless integration, and exacting discriminatory power. Indeed, when critics point out that a surveillance technology does not work, one wonders if they would be thrilled if it did. Rather than confronting the dystopian potentials inherent in the maximum surveillance scenario, the political methodological knife fight seems to unwittingly help drive systems toward developing ever greater capacities. I mean, for people who've been following the discussion about facial recognition, like this is like a smack in the face. It's actually remarkable how similar this is. But this is not about facial recognition. This is just about surveillance cameras, right? And I actually think there's a really interesting potential lesson here to learn from advocacy around surveillance cameras, which largely were ineffective. But you know, this is exactly the kind of same argument here, that by making it sort of about how well this works, you've already kind of lost the argument. Okay. And again, a kind of slightly different point here is that this work ends up distracting us from other issues. This seems to be like the core point in the piece by Julia and Helen, that by kind of focusing on issues of bias and by kind of really pushing these front and center, that we're able to kind of crowd out structural issues that probably are like more important and in many ways would be like much more difficult to deal with politically, right? Bias ends up being the kind of convenient thing to deal with. And so you can imagine that there's a relationship here sort of between like incrementalism and the fact that these things distract, in the sense that by being involved in work on fairness and machine learning, in some sense we might be forestalling more radical change, right? That you're kind of complicit in the process of making sure that this institution remains as it is, and that we only kind of make these changes around the edges. And I have to say that in teaching a lot of this material or these ideas to students, like this is often where they kind of end up. They have this kind of like, well, like am I sort of fundamentally a part of the problem if what I'm doing is sort of computational? Because ultimately it's sort of like this, you know, incremental change, not necessarily getting us to focus on these more radical things that have to happen. Okay, so this is sort of like my way of trying to parse what is often like these, you know, I think very compelling, but maybe not as systematic critiques of some of the work. And I now want to kind of relate this to politics, so like straight up politics, because I think this also accounts for some of the kind of differences in views. So I spent many years when the kind of the work on fairness and machine learning was first starting, being very concerned with this, right? I thought that there would be largely like a right-wing critiques that said something like, you should not be trying to achieve political goals by tinkering with the algorithm. So to be more explicit, right? You should not kind of engage in affirmative action under the cloak of machine learning, right? This was like my main concern. I was thinking eventually this work is going to be understood enough that the more kind of conservative side will say like, this is ridiculous, like what are you doing? This is politics by other means in a way that's often obscured. And interestingly, this hasn't really come to pass. Instead, this is what has come to pass. It's the kind of left who has been making the critique, which is that you can't achieve these political reforms through tinkering, right? So it's sort of saying like something that's a bit complimentary, rather than saying that you shouldn't engage in this, it's sort of saying if you think you are engaging in this to have these more radical reforms, you're mistaken, right? And so I'll give you an example of how this might play out. So how many people know HireVue? Okay, so HireVue is a company that kind of helps sort of whittle down the set of applicants for a job, and they do automated video interviews. And so they actually assess applicants using computer vision to kind of figure out, like, are these the right people, or who are the kind of best candidates to pass along to the employer. So it's not making the ultimate employment decision, not saying like who's going to get hired. It helps the employer sort of funnel people through the process. But just to be clear, right, I think this is well known because it strikes people as quite remarkable, right? There's an automated process of using video interview footage to determine who should be passed along as like a desirable candidate. So there's no human involved in that process at all. And this was kind of controversial. People, were quite upset that there was even a belief that you could do this. There are some problems we could get into if we want to about how this is set up. But the company, like many companies at this point, has sort of tapped into the work on fairness machine learning, right? So there's a blog post from some time ago describing how the company tries to deal with this possibility of algorithmic bias, and it goes into some detail. It's actually quite hard to parse exactly what they're doing, but they're doing something, right? There's like kind of attempt to use some of the ideas from fairness machine learning to deal with what were identified as the obvious potential problems with this process. And what's kind of interesting about this is that it kind of invites criticisms from both sides, right? So it seems likely that what the company is doing is trying to like force some particular distribution of candidates by making sure that pool that you hand over to the employer does not violate this 4/5 rule, meaning that, let's say we think about gender, right? The set of candidates you're going to pass along will not have a greater than 20% difference between men and women, right? It can't be greater than that. And so in a way, you can make sure that your model will never like violate that kind of constraint. And depending on your politics, you might think of that as being like a good thing, right? We're going to use this as a mechanism to try to do something a little bit more progressive. But from a more conservative perspective, you might say like, well, no, like you're kind of pursuing something that's a fundamentally political goal using this kind of fair machine learning, right? So this is a critique from the right. And then the critique from the left might be something like, well, you're going to tell me that you've like solved this problem using some of these techniques from fairness and machine learning, but like actually this is still like a fundamentally objectionable or suspect application, right? Like we shouldn't believe that using computer vision to evaluate candidates is like a valid thing, right? Okay. And so you might take from this that like what both kind of camps want is a more overt politics, right? That like there's a fair amount of political debate that's happening in what is this kind of obscure discussion about how to deal with fairness and machine learning. So really what this should be is just like taking this directly into the political process, being very explicit and forthcoming about your politics. And I actually do think that like in the absence of this, things can go very badly, right? So if companies, for instance, begin to use this work but are not very forthcoming, I think they're going to end up being attacked from both directions. Okay. And now I'm going to like relate a little bit of what I was saying to what I think is maybe the cause for some of these like bold, sweeping claims about fairness that people are making using some of the work in fairness and machine learning. So I'm calling this the paradox of precision. And what I mean by this is like the very existence of some of these definitions or tools or methods understood not as diagnostics, but actually as like a solution to the problem, has begun to kind of support what are ultimately very sloppy, very cynical assertions. In the sense that because now we have this like set of tools, as Tina was mentioning yesterday, right? So someone, I guess from Google, told Helen, oh, we've solved this problem, right? The idea that you can make such an assertion in a way like depends on the belief that we have these kind of precise tools, but in a way like the assertion that we solved this problem lacks specificity, right? Like, we don't know really what that means. And so this is kind of weird outcome, right? We have like very precise definitions which allow for these completely like underspecified claims which sort of like put to rest all these concerns, which just seems like the wrong outcome, right? What you would hope is that precision doesn't allow this to happen, right? That we can't get away with these like sweeping claims of fairness. And I actually think, so I mean, another thing to say here is that like there's a danger for like these kind of certifications of fairness becoming like the next privacy policy, right? This is like a meaningless statement that sort of assuages people's concern, but it like actually lacks any kind of specificity. And I actually think there's interesting lessons to draw from differential privacy. Just as like show of hands, how many people know a little bit about differential privacy? Okay, for those who don't, I'll just say in passing very quickly. Differential privacy comes out of computer science and is trying to provide a rigorous definition of what privacy should mean. And so this is kind of mathematically specified. And the problem they're trying to deal with for the most part is when you say that your data will be anonymous. So you can think, for instance, of trying to enroll people in a medical study. And you make assertions that we will keep your data private. What does that actually mean, right? And historically what that would have meant is like, we remove obvious identifiers like your name or your social security number, right? But work for many years has shown that that's insufficient to guarantee that you will not be re-identified. There are many such methods we can use to figure out that this record must refer to you. And so differential privacy is a way of trying to specify mathematically the degree to which we can actually assert that your privacy in the sense of you will not be identified as a person in this database can be sustained, right? How credible is this claim? And I think what's interesting from the kind of history here is that differential privacy actually was like remarkably useful politically in the sense that it was a tool not just to like achieve some technical goals, but as a way of saying like your completely underspecified facile definition of privacy is like garbage, right? Like what are you doing? When you make these assertions, I'm going to challenge you to actually tell me what you're doing, right? So there's been like a lot of power to this precision because it's a tool for advocates and for other people to kind of press for details, right? What's been kind of disappointing about the work in fairness and machine learning is that the opposite has kind of happened, right? It's like been a way to cover over things where you actually want specificity. And so my hope anyway is that like at least the academic community, maybe the advocacy community, can use some of these definitions of fairness in the way that we were able to maybe use it here in differential privacy, which is like when someone says, well, my model is fair, right? Now we actually can say like, what does that mean? Right? Like actually tell me what that means. And that might be true even for companies who are using these techniques, right? So it's not just that like we're forcing people to kind of think in the vocabulary of these formal definitions. It's like someone is choosing the definition in some cases, and they actually are probably not going to disclose exactly how they chose it or what trade-off they were making. And they'll just say it's fair, right? But now we can actually turn to them and be like, well, in what sense? Like, what did you actually choose? And so I think this is maybe like the promising lesson to draw from differential privacy. But there's also a flip side here, right? So differential privacy, for the most part, is largely designed to be a way to facilitate data analysis, right? It's a way to provide guarantees of privacy to people whose data would be in the data that's subject to analysis. But the whole point is that, I mean, you can think of it this way, right? If I can't guarantee your privacy, you might not enroll in this study, right? If I can't guarantee that I'm going to keep your data anonymous, you will not, participate in this clinical trial, right? So the hope here is that, like, by ensuring these kind of guarantees, you make sure that people are willing to participate. And then the whole point is that, like, yes, you're going to introduce some kind of noise to make sure that it's difficult or impossible in some cases to re-identify the person, but you want to make sure that the analysis you do with that data is still practically useful, right? That we're actually able to conclude things that are useful in the world. In fact, that's the whole point of it, right? That we don't want to lose all the kind of information, all the signal in the data when we're trying to preserve people's privacy. Now, what's weird about this is it kind of means that, like, once you do this, you can kind of do whatever you want, right? So, like, we're going to apply differential privacy and then build whatever model we might want to build. And it may turn out that that model is itself something we object to, right? So we might have, like, concerns that you've built some kind of model to infer something that we think probably shouldn't be that easy to infer anymore, right? So something that we now have a mechanism to infer, let's say, your mental status from your tweets. And we may have done this using some kind of differential privacy methodology where the people whose tweets were the trading data were protected, but now there's some model in the world which allows us to kind of subject everyone to that inference, right? So again, this is kind of getting the idea that like we're able to provide some kind of guarantees, but maybe our problem here has less to do with like the process and more to do with like what it allows us to do in the world. So we might just object fundamentally that such things should exist. And I guess, maybe the whole point is that like really we shouldn't think of this as kind of, once you're able to pass this test for fairness or once you satisfy differential privacy, you're free to do as you please. I think the point is that like that's something, and then of course there are additional questions we have to ask as well, right? So even if your model, for instance, for facial recognition is not biased, we still have to ask these additional questions. In the same way that even if you've used differential privacy to build this model, we might ask, how are you going to use this model? What is the purpose of this model? Okay. Right, so now let me kind of still try to defend in some way the kind of normative heft of fairness in machine learning. So I've done a lot to kind of point out what I think are some of the weaknesses, but I actually think there's a fair amount still to recover. And it's a little unclear in some cases, like what is the problem to which fair machine learning is even a solution? I mean, yesterday and the day before, we even had some trouble figuring out like what is the normative principle that is encoded in some of these definitions, right? I'll kind of address this in a slightly different way. So like some of the work seems to be about the fact that there might be differential measurement errors. So for instance, some populations might be mismeasured systematically in a biased way, right? So like if our label is whatever, arrests, right? This is in a way a kind of like measurement problem because like we're not really measuring populations in the same way. And so we might think of fairness in machine learning as a way to deal with differential mismeasurement, something like that. Or you could think of fairness in machine learning as a way of dealing with disparities in model performance, right? So it may be that like, we have clean measurement, but for reasons having to do with maybe the fact that there's a smaller sample of a minority population, our model just doesn't perform equally well for some population, right? And so fairness is a way of sort of addressing differences in model performance. It could also be like something further downstream, right? So what we care about really isn't just like the model's performance. What we actually want to force here is like a particular distribution of decisions, right? So some people like are kind of mostly concerned with just making sure that the model is equally accurate, regardless of what that means in terms of the outcome, right? Who gets jobs, who gets admitted. They just want to make sure accuracy isn't unequal. But maybe you actually care about the decision, not just the model performance. And finally, I think this is the more progressive vision, is like maybe we actually think about something like, we care about just disparities in the actual outcome. So even though we can correctly predict the outcome, but given unfair circumstance, right? So we have some ideas that this comes from the reason that there is some kind of disparity in these true outcomes is because of something that's fundamentally unfair itself, right? And then these are all actually quite very different problems. Some of them are almost like perfectly in line with what you would want to do just to do machine learning well. Or if you have like a rational business interest, it probably makes sense to deal with the first two, right? It's basically just making sure that you're doing good machine learning. It becomes a little bit less clear, how people might feel as you go down this list. Yeah. So there's a kind of more of a critical edge, I would say, as you progress down this list, right? So this stuff at the start is sort of like table stakes, right? Like, yes, the data we use should be like the appropriate measurement. Models should be like, perform well, great. But as we kind of progress down this list, it becomes something a little bit more critical, right? Certainly trying to minimize disparities in decisions, meaning like admissions rate or hiring rates, that ends up being much more akin to the kind of things that we have with affirmative action. And these other things too are even kind of more broader arguments about trying to really undo these kind of unfair circumstances that people confronted in their lives. Okay. So, I think there's kind of a way of breaking this apart in like a sense where we're trying to achieve substantive goals, like, for instance, minimize inequality in society along these lines, but we're doing it with changes to procedure, right? Changes to decision making. And obviously, we should not overestimate what we can achieve in terms of substantive policy goals by simply changing the process, the procedure, right? But we also shouldn't underestimate it, right? Like, it's not that it's doing nothing. And I think the goal here is that like we can actually realize some pretty powerful substantive policy goals through changes in decision making. It's just a matter of understanding how effectively we can do that, rather than sort of rejecting the possibility that we can do it at all. And I think there's really interesting lessons here to just learn from discrimination law. And actually, I think the argument I will make here at the highest level is that pretty much all the criticisms of fairness in machine learning are really just criticisms of discrimination law. I mean, this is going to be like my strongest assertion. So if you kind of step back and you're asking, like, why are we dissatisfied with some of the work in fairness in machine learning, it ends up really just being about like why changes in decision making are inadequate, which is another way of saying that like if your point of intervention is going to be based on discrimination law, you're going to find this inadequate, right? So to kind of rehearse what was discussed in the first day, right, we have these two different principles. So on the left, you would have disparate treatment, right, which is kind of anti-classification orientation, where your notion of equality of opportunity is sort of saying like, let's make sure that people who are similar with respect to this decision are treated similarly. And then you have a kind of more ambitious notion of anti-subordination, which is sort of getting at distributive justice, right? We want to make sure that there isn't inequality along these lines in society. And you kind of think of that not just sort of like necessarily achieving perfect equality, but it's sort of an injunction to minimize inequality of outcome as much as possible, right? So if you remember this kind of three-step test from disparate impact that has this final step test that says, is there an alternative that you might use that has a less disparate impact but continues to serve the same business goal? And that's this kind of argument that like you should minimize to the degree possible on any avoidable inequality, right? Okay. Now, people have written about the history of the civil rights movement, and in a way, I think it's important to understand that like civil rights in a way were this very significant bargain, right? So it wasn't an attempt to sort of like restore people for the long historical injustice they had suffered. It was sort of a way of saying like, we're going to change the way decisions are made so that from this point on, right, they will not be subject to unfair decisions. And this, of course, had more important like political goals, right? So their kind of moral standing in society and their political standing in society also changes as a consequence of asserting that these are irrelevant characteristics with respect to certain decisions. But it's important to think about the fact that this was still just changes to like the nature of decision making, right? This was not some like radical social policy that involved economic redistribution, right? This was like, I'm going to change the way we're making decisions. And as came up, I think, in the talk again on Friday, the thinking early on was that this could be like an anti-subordination mechanism to the degree to which it actually was meant to be a way to force, for instance, employers to incur some costs to, over the long run, kind of extract people from this subordinated position in society. And so here, like, you know, it's sort of thinking like maybe over generations, right, this process of providing such rights will mean that people are able to escape this subordinated position. But of course, like the critique that we've had for literally generations has been like, it's absurd to think that by just making sure that the same rules apply to people in radically different circumstance is going to generate justice, right? I mean, this is just like profoundly, on its face, like absurd. And this is, I think, the same argument that we would have ultimately to, I think, of the fairness and machine learning work, right? So when people are saying that these things are inadequate, I feel like what they're also saying is like discrimination as our mechanism for potentially adjusting these societal injustices is just going to be inadequate, right? So that's not to say that this critique is wrong. In fact, I think this critique is absolutely right. And it's very interesting to think about why we ended up with this particular bargain. But it does mean that maybe the critique is misplaced if the focus has been on fairness and machine learning rather than on using civil rights as the mechanism for addressing kind of profound societal injustices. So I guess the kind of question is, like, does this just recapitulate the same problems we have with discrimination law? Or does it overcome it in some ways? And I have some ideas about this second question, but I'll not necessarily answer them. In fact, I'd love to hear what people think. Like, is there something different about fairness and machine learning that means that we're not just in the same exact situation we've been in for discrimination law? Okay, and I'll just kind of finish up now with, with this kind of, what I think is like a difficult position. So, in many cases, I think decision-making is inescapable, right? So as much as I've kind of argued that the problem here is that we're narrowly focused on decision-making, in many settings, it's not really obvious how to avoid it, right? And some of the proposals, which I think are quite reasonable, have been to say that like the way to deal with it is to avoid it, right? So we might say that we can render decision-making unnecessary if we live in a society that has kind of like reasonable economic redistribution, right? We don't have to kind of deal with like figuring out how to allocate scarce beds, right, for homeless people if we actually just allocated sufficient resources to this problem in the first place. So maybe we render decision-making unnecessary by simply providing the necessary resources, right? Or the alternative would be like we want to reject this out of hand, right? So like forget facial recognition, like this is not something that we kind of figure out by tinkering with the way it works. We just want to reject it. But I actually think that the challenge here is that in many cases, like, we can't really do either. Or even if we aspire to do either, we will continue to live in a world where we have to make decisions. And for that reason, I think people have quite reasonably advocated for accountability, right? So it's not just enough to have fairness. We actually want to have accountability for the following reasons, right? So one is that like this should be something where it's a kind of notion of fairness that is reflective of the concerns and interests of the public and affected parties, that this be the result of some kind of transparent and deliberative process. As I mentioned, it should be kind of this overtly political process where we're actually debating our political commitments and so on, and that be actually genuinely responsive to the needs and interests of the particular communities. So what this means, though, is not so clear, right? So we might do all these things, and I think we should have to do all these things, right? But if the answer is not going to be, let's reject it, but instead let's design it in a way that we think of as being designed well, right? Because we've gone through this process. We've actually made sure that we've engaged with stakeholders and so on. What does that mean, right? What does designing well mean, aside from the kind of description of the process by which we would go through designing it well, right? And here now we'll come to like some of the stuff that also came up. In a way, right, we're still going to have to be able to articulate our normative position, like our normative principles here, right? So even if we want to sort of reject the idea that we should engage in this kind of tinkering, in many cases, like we still need to be able to articulate what we want out of some kind of decision-making process. And so I think there's actually something potentially useful about the formalization process that is thrust upon us when we're using machine learning, to the extent that, as again came up, I think on the first day, if we're actually very explicit about our policy goal, that ends up making it potentially easier to debate, right? If we have to specify this is the particular outcome we care about, this is the label or target I'm going to choose as the thing I want to maximize or minimize, that becomes something much more overt and therefore potentially much more easy to debate, right? Rather than sort of like hiding away the real policy goal by, for instance, using these kind of manual procedures for developing eligibility determinations. And in some sense, you can imagine that, like, even if you're not a computer scientist, that some of the work that's kind of come out of this community gives us a vocabulary to describe these intuitions, right, or these kind of positions. Now, I'm not saying that every single political argument needs to be translated into the formal language of computer science. And in fact, it's often frustrating to kind of hear computer scientists respond to critiques by saying, okay, just like tell me the additional like factor I have to add to my model to kind of satisfy this particular demand. I think the goal should be here that like actually there's quite a lot to debate. In fact, what's been interesting about the work in fairness and machine learning is that it revealed that our scope of debate when it's come to questions of fairness have often been weirdly narrow, actually, or kind of insufficiently specific, insufficiently precise. So some of this actually makes politics even more uncomfortable because we can like no longer paper over things by saying like, okay, we're just going to have like fairness, right? We actually have to have much more deliberative, explicit disagreements. And maybe I'm being naive, but I can imagine that being a good thing rather than a bad thing, right? Where then policy making doesn't sort of get to hide what's really going on. Instead, we have to be much more upfront. So I wonder if there's an opportunity here to use some of these methods, not to kind of force formalism on everyone, but instead to kind of show that there's actually many different things to figure out, to debate. Okay, and then maybe, I'll quickly touch on this. All right, so compass has been like the example we all work on. So, I mean, one way of thinking about this is the following, right? We can think of compass as being a tool that's sort of like an up or down decision about whether to release someone. But actually in practice, and if Logan was still here, he would tell us much more, like this is actually not necessarily how decisions are made. Decisions are often made like using what you might think of as kind of conditional probabilities, right? Like if the person has this amount of support, can I then release them because it's less likely that they'll actually end up failing to reappear? And so like, what's interesting here is that we can end up having a debate about like what the set of labels might be in this model, right? So it's not just like failure to appear, it might be something like, given this particular treatment, then is there some kind of difference in the likelihood that they will reappear or be rearrested? And this can kind of go even further, right? So it's like maybe what we want to think about is like heterogeneous treatment effects. We kind of figure out like what are the kinds of people that are going to be like most receptive to different kinds of interventions, and then we're going to like tailor our decisions to that. And so it ends up turning the discussion not into one about like what is this person going to do given like circumstances that are unchangeable. It instead kind of puts the burden on using these methods to figure out like what kind of interventions can we make in the world that will change the likelihood, and then there might be some kind of question about like what obligation there is then for the court to make this. And I mean, this is definitely work that's already been pursued, and I just kind of see this as an interesting way of kind of getting at this, right? If we have to be very specific about the kinds of things that we're predicting, then we can end up having these kinds of discussions, right? It's not just sort of like vaguely referring to recidivism, right? It's like the actual very particular details about the way these decisions are made or what options are genuinely available to us. Okay, so I've talked for a little over an hour, and I think I will stop.